Our last guest is Sooah, who wrote the text that is on our Collective Visions of Liberation mural.
My name is Sooah Kwak. I'm a program administrator here at CMAP, working with a lot of our educational initiatives and trainings. Yeah. So I think for me in this work, like social justice and diversity work, it's always really important. I think what I came to find in like Students of Color Leadership Retreat before, I think one of my main like catalyst for switching into more visionary or like liberatory work was like we asked this question about how students envision like justice at NYU, and I remember one student very specifically said like, I have no idea. And I was like, okay, well, you all are activists and like you're calling for this work, but you don't know what you're calling for. And so I think like we need to teach students a lot more, or we need to have a lot more discussions around like what we actually envision justice to be, right? And how that actually looks in spaces, because if we don't know what we're calling for, like how are we actually going to implement it?
Very true.
Yeah. And so for me, like visioning work has, and like creativity and all the different skills that go behind that has always been really important. But I also think it's really important that students of color specifically like don't get stuck in only focusing on like whiteness and also like opposing oppression and dismantling, and I think that's very crucial, right? But like we also, again, that other piece of like what are we upholding instead, or what are we going to implement instead, but also along with that, like how do we center our communities and like our own like ways of living the way we want to live, right? Because I think, yeah, we get so stuck in like, everything is so overwhelming, blah, blah, blah. But like, we don't need to wait for people to give us that permission to live the way we see fit or the way we want to live, or just like the different, yeah, I don't know. We don't need that permission, or we don't need to, like, no one's going to give that to us, right? And like, our communities are so rich with talents and skills and abilities and just like great ideas that like we don't ever center. And so like, yeah, we're always just talking about whiteness, and like we can't build our identity around only being in opposition to whiteness, because that's centering whiteness in itself,
still,
you know?
Yeah.
And so how do we build our communities and build our identity differently, and like, centering the magic that happens in like people of color spaces and things. And so that's kind of the backstory of like why I believe so much in like visioning work and thinking about liberation and centering our own communities.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So would you say that is the definition, your definition of liberation, is that focus on envisioning and executing those ideas?
I don't know if I have an actual definition of liberation. I think liberation is really personal. Like, yes, it's collective, but I think it's also really personal, because I think when we hear liberation, it's such a serious, or it feels really big, right? Like, wow, like, will we ever get there, right? And I don't think of it as like an endpoint. Like, I see it as like the little things and the little choices that you get to make every day about how you want to be and what makes you feel whole. And like, I feel like so many people of color are really trapped by like their idea of like who they should be, or like what they should be doing, or even in like social justice practice, like it has to look this way. But like justice can really look like, I'm gonna sleep in today because I'm taking care of myself, or I'm gonna say what I want to say because my voice is important, right? And so like even little things like that that people don't typically or traditionally define as justice, I think is like what liberation looks like for me.
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
not a sexy answer, but like to me that's what it is. I don't know.
Do you have any other examples of what liberation looks like? So yeah, you talked about it being super personal and those like everyday decisions that you make. Yeah, is there anything else?
That's so difficult. I think for me it's about just choosing a different way, right? I think we get so stuck in, it's always been this way, or it has to be this way, but like, no, we can choose different things and alternative ways to be and do things. And like, I think also in New York, we just care so much about like comparing ourselves to others, like, oh, they did it this way, or like, people are here and I'm here. But like, I don't know, life is such a process, and like you really get to control like what that looks like for you. And yeah, so it can be really like big and lofty, but it can also just be like, I'm not moving away. I'm not moving out the street for these people, and like that's liberation to me. So yeah,
if just, that's the case, then I practice it every day.
Oh, me too. Yeah, I'm not getting off the sidewalk for you. So yeah, I think it's about transforming and like choosing again a different way. Yeah,
I like that, because I think liberation does seem very aspirational to people, and like we'll never get there because it's so different from what we're living now, but you have to start somewhere. Yeah.
So yeah, and I think a lot of this work is about helping people uncover that and like get rid of all that messaging that says like we aren't enough, or like we need more and more things, or we need to build all these skills and or whatever, or achieve certain positions. And it's like, no. It's already there, and it's a matter of just like coming together in community. I think affirmation is such a huge part of liberation, and like valuing each other's like differences and valuing each other's different experiences and stuff. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, whiteness is such a lie of like I don't know. I'm just so bored with whiteness, right? And like I don't ever understand why that's such a huge part of diversity work, of like always talking about what to do with white people. Like, I'm not really interested in that. And like, yes, it's a space we have to navigate all the time, right? But like, I'd rather focus my time and energy on building up my own communities and like supporting them and uplifting them, versus like, I just don't have the time for white people, honestly, or energy for it. It's not sustainable, right? And so for building up something different, I think that's just a more productive use, in my opinion.
For sure.
Yeah. White people are just always gonna be white people and do what they do, and like sure, go for it. And they're like, that's the work that y'all have to do, right? But like, I'd rather spend my time joyfully and with each other and supporting each other, right? And we get to choose where that happens.
Very true. Yeah, liberation is joyful. I like that.
Yeah. It's not like sad all the time or tragic all the time. It's
like
messy,
angry,
right? But that's also joyful, right? Just going and embracing mess together, I think, is joyful.
Yeah, definitely.
I heard this quote once. It's like, white people need to love black people more than they hate the state, or something like that. And and so like, yeah, I think real transformation really comes from like that human piece of it, of like actually caring for each other, because at the end of the day, like that's what it is, right? And like, as fluffy and whatever that sounds, like that's what it is. And that's where like our time should be. And even like MLK said things like, you know, the end goal for me isn't like policy changes, it's like creating a community that like actually cares about each other and like depends on each other. And so I mean, you can't really have any of these words divorced from each other, but for me, justice is about more like not correcting, but like bringing justice, I guess, for past like disenfranchisement or past oppressions, like making sure that reconciliation piece is there. Liberation is more like future based for me, of like, where do we want to go from there? But I don't think you can have one without the other. But yeah, I often say social justice is not only the dismantling, which I think everyone gets stuck around, but again, like that upholding of the alternative model, which I think liberation thinking really helps with that piece, which is the piece people often forget, right? What are we, if we're going to opt out of all these things, what are we opting into?
Yeah, and I think it's hard for people to hard to convince people that it's worth changing unless they see the viable alternative.
Yeah.
But we don't spend time on that viable alternative, so of course
like,
you wouldn't buy into it.
A lot of these softer skills, like we're having the event Decolonize the Imagination, and like I'm really excited about that event because I think imagination, again, as soft and like whatever it sounds, like it's super crucial, and like systems, like even like school, right, or like capitalism, literally prevent us from being creative and being like having that imagination, right? Like capitalism is always something where people are like, I really just can't imagine like what system I can opt into, right? But like capitalism hasn't actually been around that long, and like we existed without it for so long, right? And other countries also exist without it, and so like I don't know, the systems and things are in place where it just feels really overwhelming, where like nothing else is possible, right? Or like we've always done this, right? Like even for me, like if I can't buy this from Amazon, where am I gonna buy it from, right? And so like imagination, I think, is such a crucial skill that we never talk about or never get to actually imagine, but like also like what it would take to implement that vision. And I think also like something else I thought about during like decolonization training is that like we also can't imagine the past of like how people lived before this and like the wisdom of our ancestors and things like that. And so like how do we weave those two different pieces together to like again really get past those limits of like what we can envision for ourselves. And I know people have circumstances, and it's not about like shaming people about their choices and like what they have to do to survive, but like yeah, where are the areas that we can like slowly or even smallly just opt out and not get bogged down by the feelings of being overwhelmed.
Yeah,
I know those aren't sexy answers either.
No, I think this is really cool because like where else would, I don't know, if you're not in this work, I think you don't often have an opportunity to think about these kinds of things in really abstract ways and just throwing ideas out there. So I'm hoping that someone who listens to this thinks like, oh yeah, you know, maybe that is like another way of looking at it or thinking about it.
Live the way you want.
Yeah, live your life. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at Unpack That Podcast and follow NYU CMEP on Instagram and let us know what you think. See you next time.